Welcome to the Still Life podcast, a series of 21 topics, with each episode exploring the practical nature of the spiritual experience. With time-tested insights from psychotherapy, evolutionary biology, and meditation, from ex-animator and stillness coach, Jim.
Because I view Jim George as a trainer for the soul. There's no better animation artist, drawer than Jim.
He is a friend, he is a mentor, incredible advisor. There's no one who's more important to me in my life.
The most interesting, most intelligent person I've ever met.
He truly is somebody who wants nothing from you and everything for you.
My name is Henry, and I'm a former client of Jim's, and the work we've done together over the past 8 years has changed my life. We're now on a mission to share these insights with you, and to draw some pretty interesting conclusions on how to live a still life. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Still Life podcast. My name is Henry, I'm your co-host, and today's episode is 5 of 21 in our mini-series. So we'll be talking about focus. Now, focus is something that I think Jim is particularly well-versed in talking to, because he is probably the most focused man I know. I've come to him with some really boring nonsense, and he has managed to hold focus for hours. And that to me is worthy of sainthood. So in the discussion today, we outline what focus is, how we focus and defocus, again, where this came from an evolutionary perspective, why as a species we have this ability to focus and defocus on things. That's always one of my favorite parts, because it's really cool to bring a lot of this stuff up from your subconscious mind and then be able to recognize it in real time. Like, wow, I'm really not focusing on what this person is saying. I always find that fascinating. But we talk about exactly that, how to maintain focus in conversation, how stillness is a big part of it, and how we can focus externally on things and train that type of focus, but also we can focus internally on the narration or focus on stillness within ourselves. And so I really hope, as always, that you get as much out of this episode as I did. But again, as always, I'll leave that for you to decide. So sit back and enjoy. Hello, Jim.
Oh, Henry.
How you doing?
I'm doing remarkably well. Much better for having seen you.
Oh, well, we have a fun discussion today.
Oh, good. You know how to pick them.
Well, this one I think many people struggle with, and I think they struggle with it because there's a large extrinsic pressure from the Western society to produce.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
There's like, you've got to get good at working and you've got to work a lot.
That's right.
And
until you die.
Yeah, until you die.
Then you can rest.
Yeah. And a big component to that is the ability to focus.
Ooh, absolutely.
And so that is our topic for today, focus.
I like this.
I do too.
So before we get into the topic, I just would like to mention something that might make it easier for us to understand what it is we're doing here. I'd like to suggest that as brilliant as your questions are, and they are, they're incredibly thoughtful, they're deep. I don't have the answers to your questions. I'd like to suggest that what we're engaging in here is an inquiry. I don't know much of anything, but when we engage in this inquiry, we get into a state of wide open awareness. We quiet our mind, relax our body, calm our emotions, just settle in. And what happens is we open up what I can only call a sacred portal to the infinite, to the universe. Information, which is available all the time, starts to flow because it's not being blocked by our egoic need to have the answers. So I hope this makes it easier for people to know what it is we're doing. I'm not an answer man. I don't know much of anything. But this inquiry includes everyone who's listening to it. That makes it pretty important, makes it pretty sacred. So I don't mean to hijack your forum here, but I think
Not at
that's
all.
important to say.
I think so too. And I don't think there really are ever any discrete answers to any questions, especially when they come to such open-ended questions such as what is focus?
Yeah.
To me, it seems far more of a continuous kind of discourse, a discovery.
That's right.
And the reason that I love these topics so much is because I think that you yourself have been so thoughtful and so reflective for such a long period of time that hearing your insights makes it, you're a great dancing partner, right? and I think that you're absolutely right that this includes everybody else too.
Yeah.
Because at least selfishly what I'm after with these types of discussions is the state.
Yeah.
It's that
There you
state
go.
of eager anticipation, that state of understanding,
Yeah.
of self-discovery.
There you go.
And that I think everybody can share as well, because if you're listening or pausing to discuss with someone next to you,
Yeah.
you know, I think that state is very much permeable and can pass through the boundaries of, well, it used to be sort of bound geographically in
Yeah.
the sense where people in China probably couldn't hear our discussion
Right.
200 years ago.
Right. Must have had very good ears.
Yeah, very good ears. Or just dug a really deep hole. But now we've got the luxury of technology.
Yeah.
And I know that these discussions, for me, in the start of our work together, really helped me to understand how to navigate this world in a far, I wouldn't say easier way, because the truth sometimes is difficult, but in a far more realistic way.
Yeah.
And when aligning yourself with reality, I think that it provides a lot more purpose, I would say.
You're right.
There's a depth to it instead of just sort of shallowly skimming the surface of life without really engaging with this world around us.
Yeah.
So
There's a difference between this process, this inquiry that's going on all the time, and the fruit or the result of that inquiry. So be aware that the more we engage in the inquiry, we're in that state. The more we get back out of that state, that expansive state of inquiry, and we hold on to what we think are the answers, something changes. And we want to remember that, because some of the most deep thinkers in history have just made a lifetime of this inquiry. And they're less interested in the answers than they are the questions.
Well, two come to mind instantly, and that would be Richard Feynman and Albert Einstein. Both of those scientists really lauded the intuitive aspect of their lives, and also practiced different ways of getting into different types of states.
Yes.
For example, they were both great musicians.
Yes.
And so I think that that's such a key point to highlight, because that was actually one of the largest epiphanies for me when doing our work together, was straying away from wanting to be the guy with the answers in an academic field, and holding that as some status symbol above others in order to promote my own longevity.
Sure.
Instead, it's been far more so to lean more into the curiosity of just engaging with this world in as many ways as possible, and not necessarily pigeonholing myself. And that's why I just have to tip my hat to you, because you taught me that it's not about the answers, it really is about the questions. And you never get some very neat 2 + 2 = 4 type, sort of solution from this inquiry with the universe. You only ever get more and more understanding at deeper and deeper levels. And it's that state, to me, it's like that pursuit is autolytic, it's self-fulfilling. It just makes you feel so good.
Yes.
You can feel it right now, because I'm slipping right into it.
We've done it. And that's what I just want to make clear, so that people don't think this is two more talking heads just throwing words back and forth. We're engaged in a deep state, something that I think is nothing less than miraculous. This ability to connect with another human being, and the information that comes out of that is exponential to what happens when you're sitting contemplating your own navel. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So I didn't mean to hijack the forum.
If that's your version of hijack, you can hijack whatever you want. That's just awesome. So, let's start where we usually start.
Okay.
Let's define the play space. How do you define focus?
Wow. That's tricky. We can define it mathematically. We can define it in terms of physics. But I think what you're referring to is how do we define it in terms of awareness or attention. But ironically, the physics piece of the definition can be very helpful. I think it was Kepler, Johannes Kepler, the famous German mathematician, astronomer, first used this Latin word focus, which initially meant a domestic hearth, a fireplace in a home. It's like, what? But if you think about it, in Latin times, Roman time, that hearth was the center of activity in the home. And it later became known as the center of attention. And they used it metaphorically. So Kepler, I think, was the first one to use it in terms of physics and mathematics. The point of convergence, when normally parallel rays or waves of light, of heat, of sound, and for our purposes, let's say awareness, are bent by passing through a lens, refracted, or reflected in a parabolic mirror, so that they're coming together in a single point. That point was called the focus. When that focusing, that concentration occurs, well, those waves, those rays, become more focused, they become more intense, more dense. Remember as a kid playing with a magnifying glass out in the sun? You're standing out in the sun. It's warm, but comfortable. You take this magnifying glass and you hold it up against a piece of paper, and those same rays that are hitting you, warming you, but no problem, they converge on a single point. And when you get that single point, what's called the focal length, and when that single concentrated focal point is on that piece of paper, it'll burn right through that paper. It's concentrated, it's dense, it's intense. So that, in a way, helps us to understand what focusing our awareness or our attention is. I'd like to suggest, I like to think of focus as the concentration, concentrating our awareness on narrower and narrower fields or area until you can focus on a single point, focus on a single thought or idea, focus on a single task or activity. And focus has an inclusive and an exclusive aspect to it. The exclusive aspect of it is very frequently ignored, not thought about, forgotten, but it's equally important. The more you focus on a thing, the more you don't focus on everything else. And again, this is our beautiful universe reminding us of wholeness. You can't really disengage from wholeness. So the whole universe is there. We're focusing on one thing, but the rest of the universe is still there. We're just ignoring it. So it's important to remember that focus includes the ability to not focus on whatever else is happening. That's where we get into the idea of distraction. See, everything else is trying to get your attention as well. And when we say focus, we tend to mean intentionally concentrating our awareness on something, as opposed to just having it happen autonomically. Does that help?
Yes, as always, 10 out of 10. So when thinking about this from an evolutionary perspective, it seems as if focus and distraction are both really helpful tools, or were very helpful tools for our ancestry to navigate a terrain.
Yes.
Because you want to get distracted by something that could potentially be threatening,
yes,
but you also want to focus on something you might want to eat or whatever.
Sure.
Right? So would you mind just expanding on sort of how environmental pressures influence that balance, and then how the ability to focus and the ability to get distracted have been sort of taken advantage of in today's day and age?
Sure.
That might be too big of a question,
Well,
so
let's
let's chunk it up a little
there.
bit. Yeah.
Let's kind of unpack it a little bit. This is why I love this. Your mind is very penetrating when it engages in this inquiry. It lights the thing up. So evolutionary pressures. Let's first think about we as biological creatures. As we evolved, and I'm talking evolving from single cell biological creatures, it became more and more important for us to be able to perceive, to be aware of our environment. And again, if we think about those three legs of the stool that represent survival, and there's a lot more elaboration to them, but these are the basics. In order to avoid what they call predation, being eaten, right? We need to be able to perceive the environment as a whole, what's called the ground, the background, or the field. That's everything within a reasonable distance from where we as biological creatures are. So we perceive the background, the whole thing. We're not, by definition, focused on anything. We're just perceiving. That began with photosensitivity, light sensitivity, being able to perceive light and dark. And it just evolved from there, iterated from there. When biological creatures then perceive the field, it became important to then be able to discern any object within that field from the field. And to a degree, that's a process going on in our neurology, including what we call edge detection, the ability to perceive. And I'm going to say, I don't want to elaborate too much, but I'm going to say to perceive the illusion that some object is separate, in fact, from the universe. But for our purposes, it was essential for survival. A predator is separate from everything else that isn't trying to eat us. And we needed to be able to perceive that. We start perceiving that by developing these more and more sophisticated sense organs. But it's important to remember that our sense organs are perceiving, they're sensing disturbances in our environment. Light bouncing off of something because it's disturbing the normally continuous flow of this light is captured by our optical sense organs, our eyes, and translated through our brain into an image. Same thing happens with sound. Something is disturbing the air in the atmosphere around us. We can hear that, hear it. There is no intrinsic sound. We're hearing, we're perceiving disturbance in the air. It's translating into sounds deep in the cochlea and then going from there into our brains. And that's where the sound actually exists. It's in our mind. Same thing with the kinesthetic, the feeling. Something disturbs the atmosphere, our environment, even coming to the point where it's bumping up against us. We sense that kinesthetically. It's important to remember those are our senses. They're not what's intrinsically happening out there. I'd like to suggest there's no intrinsic red anywhere. We're perceiving certain frequencies of light. We perceive that and then call it red. That's just a kind of almost a provincial limitation of our ability to perceive beyond our own senses. When we perceive an object, however we're perceiving it, it no longer is the background. We begin to focus. We have the ability to focus or concentrate our awareness onto that object. And in the sense of our eyes, we have what's called foveal vision, right in the middle, right in the center. That's where the detailed vision is. Everything else is peripheral vision. And it's important to remember this term. We pay attention. It costs us to attend to something. And remember, our biological bodies are on this energy budget. So is it worth paying attention to everything? No. But if it's a potential predator, if it's a potential food source or energy source, if it's, in our case, a potential mate, well, it is worth paying attention. So I'd like to suggest that this evolutionary pressure to perceive and to be able to focus our attention comes directly from a need to survive and the ability to distinguish an object from the field that's everything else. That's all focusing is. And then to your point, the ability to defocus again and then perceive the environment again for more opportunities, more threats. So I hope that's answering the evolutionary pressure part of the question and how that has evolved. And in our case, visually, auditorially, and kinesthetically primarily. And we've got the olfactory, the smell, and the gustatory, the taste as well. Does that make sense, or did I just wander off?
I'm really glad that you only answered the first half of that question because that was a very thorough explanation.
Well, they're deep questions, yeah. I'm telling you.
Do you mind if I regurgitate that back up and you kind of
I'd love to. I'll try not to get any on me.
Yeah, we're a bit maybe.
Yeah.
So from what you're saying is that as we started to evolve even from just unicellular organisms, the ability to understand and perceive the environment around us started in very rudimentary terms, whether it be light or dark, and then it started to iterate and build upon that.
Yes.
Now we have these certain gateways to understanding the universe, which are primarily our senses, and they're different portals.
Right.
And you touched upon vision primarily, because vision is something that it's our primary sense. It takes up 1/6 of the brain's energy output, which is incredible. And what you mentioned there is two parts: the foveal vision, and that's the ability where it's like to just see something in focus, and everything else in the periphery is out of focus. So this is touching upon one of the points that you were making, where focus is both inclusive and exclusive.
Yes.
And then there was also the part of edge detection. So the ability to distinguish information throughout the universe, and to ascribe meaning to it, not to touch back too deeply onto another talking point, but to ascribe meaning to it, that can happen in all of our senses. You used vision because it's the easiest to click into, because it's our primary sense. But you can do that with, there's a lot of background noise that's going on right now that we're not necessarily attending to. We're sort of dropping it out because it's not significant. It doesn't hold importance. So you're focusing more on what it is that I'm saying, because the information that I'm conveying might have some more utility potentially to your survival.
And that's what we call the signal. And everything else we call noise. But it's very interesting, because if I wanted to know what it is that is flying overhead right now, or whatever that sound was right there, I completely switch in a split second, and I'm thinking, Harley Davidson, 74 cubic inch. Yeah, and I've just missed the last 12 things you said, because that became signal and your voice became noise. Remember how relative this focus thing is. There's not a particular thing that should be focused on at any given time. It's all based on what we're interested in.
And to build upon what you were talking about earlier, we can't focus on everything because we don't have the energy to do so. Instead, we have to pay attention and pay close attention to what it is that's worthy of our of the energetic cost that goes into basically breaking down this information within us, within our minds. So before we get into all of the today's day and age type stuff with focus, I was thinking as you were talking, I can either be focused on you fully and what it is that you are saying, or I can be focused on thinking about what you're saying and trying to think of the next question there. And that again is a sort of, it's a dynamic. Because if I was just going to one extreme and only paying complete open attention to what it is that you were saying, if you're talking for a long period of time, I might be missing stuff at the beginning or even stuff in the middle. There might be a bias to recency and primacy and just emptiness in the middle, whatever. And so I find myself quite often trying to chunk what you're saying and like tell a mini story within myself so that I can push that information aside, get back to it when I want to. The irony is that's exactly what I'm doing right now. I was like, don't forget what Jim just said so we can talk about it later. And then be able to re-engage with it with, again, what it is that you're talking about. So that to me is, I don't think that's the kinesthetic version of focus, because it's not like I'm focusing on my toes, but there's this aspect of focusing on the thinking process that you briefly alluded to. And I was wondering if you could expand more upon that in terms of, do you want to, is it a useful ability to train that from a meta perspective, to think about that? And I mean, that's kind of a loaded question, because I think you know where this is going. And how does the ability to completely unfocus from all stimuli, to stop that narrative creating process, to stop basically trying to think about what it is that's going on, in other words, stillness, how does that help in terms of being able to navigate and ultimately reassess the ability to focus?
So you've mentioned some really important things. There are different strategies that people employ based on what they think is the best way to go about living. I'd like to suggest that, especially in today's day and age, we place a burdensome importance on the conscious cognitive process. And I'd like to suggest that as powerful, as remarkable as that is, it is the slowest and most easily overwhelmed aspect of our mind. By definition, it's the most complex. It's involving so much of our nervous system. It's a miracle we can do it at all. I'd like to suggest that there are times when, from a meta perspective, you realize, I can't possibly keep up with what you're saying by going inside and having yet another dialogue about what you're saying. So what I've done unconsciously by habit is set a preference. My thoughts about what you're saying are more important than what you're actually saying. And that will tend to impede my ability to actually understand what, in fact, you're saying. I can't arrive at that without this meta perspective, this ability to pull up above the process itself. And this is where we get into who are you really? Because if you quiet things down enough, you'll realize that you are aware of what your mind is doing. Now, when we're not in that meta position, we're stuck, we're lost in what the mind's doing. We think that's who we are. But you're up here aware of what your mind's doing. That is, you are here, your mind is down here doing. You begin to realize, wow, I'm not my mind. And if you begin to live that is, practice that, pay attention to it. You don't have to get an advanced degree in anything. You just pay attention. You begin to realize that the mind is trying very frequently, especially the conscious mind, to do things that it's utterly incapable of doing. That conscious mind is overloaded when you get past 7 to 9 bits of information. It's completely overloaded. Count backward from 100 down by threes right now.
100.
What's your social security number?
0. So, no, I don't.
No, I mean, see what happens. It's just, whoa, I can't do that. But it's not thinking I'm incapable. Your mind is dutifully doing what we've assigned it to do, which is take care of everything. Predict the future, keep me safe. It just can't. But it's saying, I'm going to do it. I'll do my best. That's my job. If we can understand that there are times when your undivided attention is not only the greatest gift that you can give someone else, but it is the only way to really get when someone else is communicating. Not just the words they're saying, not just, oh yeah, that reminds me of that time in San Francisco, but what is this other person actually saying? What is happening? That's this focused awareness.
Well, I just want to pause you for a moment because I'm just so self-aware right now in terms of the amount that I'm scribbling. And every time that I have had a conversation with you, I think probably ever, you have given me between 98 and 100% of your attention. And that is an incredible discipline. It's an incredible gift. And it's really a overlooked, I don't want to say talent, but it kind of is. Mm-hmm. And I think that this has given me food for thought not for thought, maybe for not thinking. Food for stillness.
This is why I love you. Do you hear the wisdom coming out of your own mouth?
Well, it's something that's really, wonderful, because as you were talking, I've just got a big old heart and say, I love you for this.
Oh.
And I'm like, why do I have to write this down? I'm probably not going to forget it. Maybe I should just continue to empty, continue to let go, and continue to just be here, absolutely here with what it is that you're saying, because there is so much just dense wisdom that's coming out at once. It's like, I don't want to miss something because I'm too busy ascribing more importance to my internal narrative than what it is that you're trying to communicate. Because ultimately, that's a fool's errand, especially with this dynamic, because I just think the world of your mind and you. Mm-hmm. And so to try and ascribe more importance to what it is that I want to say next, and really that just comes down to trying to sound clever for the next little bit.
Sure.
That is something that I should look to do less of.
Well, let's look at that. Remember, there's not one way to do things. We have different roles to play, if you will. I really hate to use that word, but what you're doing so well is organizing this, whatever it is I'm doing, into a form that is more easily understood. So I don't want to discourage that. I'm simply saying, in response to what you said, if you go into your head and start thinking thoughts about what's being said, you're in the past. The present is escaping you. You're focused on what's already happened. You're not focused on what's happening now. There are times when that's exactly what needs to be done. But then don't be surprised if there are gaps in your perception of what occurred. Now, you can't do both. So the question is, what are your goals? What's driving you? What are your values? That's why we come back to values again and again and again. I'm particularly happy you have the values you have. That's what makes this dynamic much more powerful than if I just sit here blowing it out my nose. What you've done beautifully is you've synopsized, you've made sure you understand something, you're engaged in a feedback process. That's all part of this inquiry. So I want to be very clear. This in no way is a criticism, it's just an observation.
Well, this is why I love you too, because you always err on the side of caution when it comes to my psychological well-being. So thank you again. Another reason why I love you. And I think that really, if we go back to values, I mentioned before that I am actively trying to have internal intrinsic growth as one of my top 3 values.
Yeah.
And
it's not so intrinsic anymore. It's extrinsic. I can see it.
Good.
I can perceive it. No, I mean it.
I know. And when it comes to that, when it comes to growth, I think that if we go back to, if we just sort of reference our meaning discussion, it's gaining the meaning from the moment, from the process, rather than the outcome.
Right.
And with this discussion in general, if I want to grow as much as possible, engaging fully with the process, the discourse, the communication with you, rather than a minor outcome being like the next question or whatever, I actually extract more information to help me grow.
Good for
right?
you.
Because from this, it's like I could be way more switched on while you're talking. That is food for stillness. That's food for growth.
Yeah.
And so it's actually coherent with one of my values.
Yeah.
And I mention all of this because as I was, again, listening to you, being more meta-aware, watching my mind going on and off and on and off, it became very clear to me that the process of stillness has helped me to be just more observant of the inner workings of my mind.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me that that wasn't the case for me a few years ago. And it's really been the practice of stillness that's helped me to decouple those things, to unstick from the mental processing. And so I'm really thinking of myself a few years ago when thinking of anybody that could be listening to this. And I might have been thinking at that point, like, what is this guy on about? What is he talking? And I'm not thinking like, oh, why? Why am I thinking about what is this guy on about?
Right.
But I think this is a fairly convenient and smooth segue to asking you if we could please get still.
Well, here's the thing. Stillness doesn't have to be a formalized practice where we stop everything, hit pause on our video cameras, and drop into some mythical state. We can do that, but what I'm suggesting to you right now is I am in the process of getting still as I'm making these small mouth noises. It may sound funny, but I'm not breathing in at all. I'm exhaling slowly with these small mouth noises riding that exhale. What's happening is I've taken a breath, I've held it, and then I'm just but those small mouth noises can ride the same exhale as I'm dropping in. My mind isn't thinking about what I'm saying or going to say or did say. I'm right here, right now, with you. And the experience of that is delicious.
Hello, just wanted to jump in here really quickly because there was an insight that I had that I thought worth sharing. So when people describe a lot of these meditative techniques, really at the core of it, what you're doing is you're training your awareness to focus on one sense at a time. For example, if you do a sound bath, that's all of the auditory information around you. You're just focusing on the sound, right? If you do a body scan, that's just focusing your kinesthetic sense on different areas of your body in a sequence. Traditional Vipassana meditation is just focusing on your breath. That's the kinesthetic sense as well. Then there's chanting and humming, and that's just focusing your awareness, again, on the sound that you create repetitively. There's mantra meditation, and that's just focusing on one word repetitively. When we train our awareness to focus on one sole point at the expense of everything else, it allows our state of mind to drop into a different feeling sense that is meditative, but it is incredibly therapeutic for us. You get the same thing if you go out surfing, right? If you're just focusing on that water in front of you, then you get into these incredible states, especially when you're surrounded by nature in a beautiful setting. So I think this is a really crucial point to helping to demystify meditation or any of these meditative practices. All it really is training internal awareness to focus on things. And then when you have that ability, you can focus on so much more externally, right? Now, stillness is the resulting state when your mind is either focused on one thing or absolutely nothing. What do I mean by this? Well, this isn't difficult. Let's try it now. Just notice, what is your mind focused on? Are you focused on making sense of the words that are coming out of my mouth? Most likely. Now that sense making is coming in the form of a narration. It's like a ticker tape on the front of your mind. You're just basically reducing this information into words, into a narrative. Now that's pretty fascinating, isn't it? How do we even do that? It just happens automatically. Well, to me, what's even more fascinating is something is observing that. What is that something? Now close your eyes and in your mind's eye, turn backwards and try and look at what is focusing. It's kind of like a Zen koan, jars the mind into focusing on nothing, into focusing on stillness. Now, hopefully you've got a momentary glimpse of what it's like for your mind to be quiet. The practice of stillness is just repeating, getting back to this state so that you can get really good at getting back to this state. That is what any practice is. The more you practice it, the better you get. The better you get, the more stillness you feel throughout your day. Now, I don't know about you, but that state feels pretty good. And it's one of those things where that state is available to you at all times, right? I've yet to meet anybody that can be happy on demand, but I know for a fact that you can still your mind no matter what the condition. And that right there gives you peace and freedom on demand. And to me, that's worth practicing. Anyway, let's get back to it, shall we?
There are people that I could mention by name because they're famous authors, writers, brilliant. But because they're so in their head about how they work, when they're speaking, you get a lot of it starts to kind of sound like they're nuts because they're hearing where they're going with their thoughts and then editing and coming back and saying, no, that's not right. Well, this speech thing that's happening, this communication, it's happening way too fast. So you have a choice. You can either think about it, you can be, again, in the attic above the party of the conversation, watching it, or you can be in it, but it takes courage to be in it. See, part of that internal dialogue is, what if I say something stupid? I have no idea what I'm saying right now. I really don't. I have no idea what's going to come out of my mouth right now. I'm assuming that it's a coherent conversation. You're not rolling your eyes, but I'm just present. And this is where a deeper level of communication comes in. This energetic level of communication. And we'll talk about this some other time. But the courage that it takes, and it takes time to develop that courage, because these social pressures are intense to be everything and be smart and not sound like an idiot. The courage to actually be present yields tremendous gifts and rewards. But again, I'm not hunting all the time for the perfect word. I'm letting the words come through by just being utterly here. And this is what I mean. I'm an idiot until I get still. And then in stillness, something bigger than me starts coming through. I don't want to listen to me until I get still. That's why I don't. If that makes sense.
It makes
so let's get still, but keep talking. Don't put your stuff down. Just now it's your turn to talk. Now it's my turn to just breathe.
It's beautiful to get into this state and to actually communicate, because so much becomes apparent.
Yeah.
And there is so much more insight to be had.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really love this as a practice and a discourse, because as you were talking again, it just became very clear from the beginning of the conversation when you were talking about the difference between focus and distractibility,
mm-hmm.
and distractibility being more correlated to threat and threat detection for our ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a state where you are fearful and afraid of things around you, you're going to be more easily distracted.
Good for you.
Like a cat.
Good
right?
for you.
Scaredy cat.
Good
right?
for you.
But if you are breathing into your lower belly
mm-hmm.
and just relaxing
mm-hmm.
and completely opening up as you are talking, it just opens up that ability to be more focused and less distracted. And so the question answered itself, where it's like, how does stillness fold in with focus? Because as you are quieting your mind and relaxing and opening up, you immediately become more focused.
Yes.
And of course, this state of mind benefited our ancestry, because when there are no threats around us or no perceived threats around us, we have the ability to converge our attention on a point in front of us and hold it for a sustained amount of time in order to, I don't know, sharpen an axe or
Yes.
light a fire
Sure.
or something like that.
Sure.
And so there was just the glunk as you're talking and we're getting still of, oh yeah, Jim's answered the question through doing rather than through talking. And as he's talking, he's also answering on a different level.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
And that brings me to my next question, where you talk a lot about scope of context.
Yeah.
And how if you change the scope of a problem, you can often find the solution to the problem.
Right.
I was wondering if you could expand upon that a bit more as it relates to focus, if you're focused on a certain level, per
Good.
se.
So, not to be cute in any way, but changing the scope of context from macro to micro is focusing. So your question is perfectly apt. And as focusing relates to problem solving, even the perception of something as a problem. It was Einstein who said, it's not me, no problem is ever solved at the level of the problem. You stay at the level of the problem, you're now part of the problem. You're not going to solve it. Problems are solved by expanding the scope of context, getting a broader view, more perspective, more elevation, if you want, above the problem, so that solution begins to present itself. Solutions to any perceived problem are everywhere. We just don't see them because we're focused on the problem. As you continue to expand the scope of context, you will eventually begin to realize there's no such thing as a problem. The problem is your response to situations. You just got a situation. There are things occurring. I need to get through this situation with certain outcomes. It's not a problem. It's an adventure. It keeps me from being bored. I expand that scope of context even more. It's not a problem. I've got no problem. I'm just having a great time navigating through something that would otherwise be boring. If everything is going smoothly the way I want it to go, I'm in hell. I don't realize it for the first 10 minutes because I think it's the answer to my prayer, but I'm dying of boredom now. We're navigating constantly, neurologically, between predictability at one end and surprise on the other end. When things are too predictable, we're bored. When things are too surprising, we're afraid. So what we're looking for is this Goldilocks sweet spot where we kind of know what we're doing, but there's this element of novelty, this element of surprise. And the ability to focus and defocus, to toggle between those two, not even between, but through the spectrum of scope of context, is what allows us to be in an optimal state to do anything. There are times when you want to be down in the weeds, focused on the details. There are times when you want to be way up here, what I call the God shot, where you see everything. And then there are times you need to be somewhere in between. So navigating between these various scopes of context is the name of the tune. That's what we're doing all of the time. And remember that The macro is where you determine what and why you're doing something, right? The micro is where that thing happens, where that thing gets done. It gets done down here in the details. And I know you know people who are really good at the detail stuff, but they've got no vision of where the overall thing's going. Conversely, you got people way up here in the blue sky realm. They can see all kinds of possibilities, and we could do this, and we can do that. Wow, yeah. But they can't get anything done because they don't know how to navigate down into the weeds of the detail that is the place where stuff gets done, one step at a time. I'm saying develop the ability to navigate, and your life will change on a dime.
One of the first sessions I ever had with you, you drew a diagram for me.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that it's apt because it's the third time that this man's come up in conversation, Mr. Einstein.
Yeah.
I was wondering, would you mind drawing that as well for the audience?
Oh, sure. Well, okay, let's start with something that's pretty well known. Pretty well known, but maybe not. What does this actually mean to you? I mean, sure, it's something you might see on a T-shirt. Yeah, it's got something to do with that guy with the funny hair. But what does this actually mean? Well, E stands for energy. M stands for mass. All objects in the universe have mass. Here on Earth, we think of that in terms almost of weight. C stands for celeritas, which is the speed of light. And squared means this times itself. But we don't need to get into the physics of this at all, even though I'd love to talk to you about this equation someday. This is a great metaphor for getting things done. How? Well, if we take this E, this energy, and we put it up here, we're thinking about now just raw, unmanifest energy, infinite potential. Okay? And we take this M and we bring it down here. This M, this is a fully manifest something. No more potential. We've got E up here, infinite potential. We've got M down here. Whatever the thing is, it's solid. It's got no more potential. Think of this as what it's like to have an idea in your mind. You want to do something, but it's all in your head. There's infinite potential. You could make an airplane. You could make a car. You could write a book. As you start to manifest this energy and work your way down into this finished object, well, things start to get a little more condensed. You start feeling a little bit more hemmed in, more restricted. Certain people are comfortable up here in what I call the blue sky, right? Infinite potential. The minute they start getting down here into actually doing one thing, that means you can't do all these other things. Now, there are other people, what I call the sharp pencil types, who are more comfortable down here in the details. They love being down here, but they don't like being up here in the we could do anything area, all right? I'd like to suggest that the secret is to get comfortable doing all of this cycle. But that's only half of the cycle, because eventually this object, whatever it is, in enough time is going to go right back up into energy again. All right? Try to remember, the more comfortable you are throughout this cycle, the more you're going to be able to do the things that you're thinking about, that you're setting out to do. Great metaphor, all right? So what I'm suggesting is, metaphorically speaking, that the universe is so holographic that the fact that this, at this totally metaphysical level, represents how our minds work, unless we train ourselves to be comfortable all the way along that arc. And this other side, what I call the path of entropy, where anything and everything that you're looking at now eventually is going to release its energy from its form back into undifferentiated energy. It's going to happen. It's happening right now. And this is an infinite cycle, but it also applies to how we think. So, scope of context from absolutely macro to absolutely micro and back again. The more comfortable you are shuttling between those, and not just one or the other, but moving comfortably through that entire spectrum, the better you're going to be at dealing with anything.
If we were to use strictly militaristic terms, energy can be sort of seen as strategy, and mass can be seen as tactics. And going from strategy to tactic is operations, right? And you mentioned that some people are more comfortable at different levels. This is what's beautiful about this as a mental model taken from physics. You can stretch it and apply it to different aspects of the universe, which to me is a hallmark of it being true. If it can apply, the pattern applies in different settings.
Because it's fractal, isn't it?
Yes.
It just
completely.
climbs up. What's true above is true below. Yeah.
And
that's
so,
a good way to test these things.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
If it fits multiple settings and it's consistent and congruent with the facts around it, I think that those are two symptoms of potentially being true. But we'll get to truth in a couple of weeks. So when it comes to that, somebody that came to mind when talking about that was Napoleon, because here's a man that, as a general, had a very, when talking about the God shot, you know, he's looking at basically the strategy from a very high level. But the reason that he got so much respect from his troops is because he would be there on the front lines, fixing the cannons and pointing them at the bloody enemy, because he was that's where he got lit up. So I think that that's an exception to the rule, as somebody that can basically apply their talent along the whole sort of scope. But what it was that you were saying along this continuum when applying it to people is that some people are more comfortable in different segments around this.
Because they're familiar with it, and they may also be wired like that. I'm saying you can learn to work your way around. It's just practice.
Yes, and I bet you also learn to where you fit the best as well, while seeing where you might misfit and realizing what you're bad at. And if we bring this back to focus, where I asked you originally, changing the scope of context can help to really help solve a problem, because you can, again, become above the problem or below the problem.
Well, let me just ask, and it's a potentially specious question, which one is better, micro focus or macro focus?
They're interdependent.
It's a stupid question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The important thing is the capacity to optimally navigate from one to the other along a spectrum based on what's required at the moment. Because if Napoleon is only good at strategizing, can't fix the cannon. Now, I'm telling you right now, in traditional military theory, the last thing you want is your commanding general to be down there in the mud fixing a cannon. Because if he gets blown off, then everybody's wandering around in the tactics, and there's nobody to figure out where we're going. So the wisdom of that is up to question. The wisdom of that in terms of inspiring your troops, no question. There's no question. But once somebody has a strategy, if they can't navigate back down into the tactics, nothing's going to happen. So you see, as you say, the interdependency of these two. Wholeness is rearing its head everywhere. And we want to pay attention to that.
So what came to mind when you were talking about that is that there are certain tasks that can be done in the tactical realm.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take this right back to the introduction to this, I think that when I originally thought about focus, the first thing that came to mind was there's a pain point that I've heard myself and other people say where it's very difficult to focus in this day and age. And if we are to sort of connect some dots with what we've been talking about so far, that implies focus on a task and prolonged focus on a task at the expense of not focusing on other things that might potentially be distracting.
Yeah.
And I asked a double part question that we can come back to now,
Sure.
because it was definitely way too much to digest in the first bite, but you know, I always try. When it comes to that type of focus, when it comes to sort of more productive work, why is it, do you think, that it's so difficult? Why is that pain point so present? Why do people say, I can't focus, or I'm not very focused, or I just can't get something done, et cetera, et cetera? Why do you think in this day and age that is such a present pain point?
What are you trying to focus on and why?
Let's use an example of I need to build an Excel spreadsheet for work.
Good. Let's look at the structure of that sentence. I need to. What would happen if we just changed one word? I want to. But I don't want to, do I? I need to. So the reality is, I don't want to focus. It's that simple. And I'd like to suggest there are ways around that. I'm in no way saying, well, geez, Henry, just focus on the shit you want to do. But what I'm saying is, it's no mystery as to why people are struggling to focus on stuff they don't want to focus on. So let's start there, because I've never talked to anyone who had trouble focusing on having great sex. I've not spoken to anyone. They've been distracted by stuff that they've made more important, like, how am I doing? Am I as good as their last partner? Am I better? Okay, that's more important to you than enjoying this, so you're focused on it. So we get back to, again, this values, these goals. Pay attention. That's where this meta perspective is very important. Why am I trying to focus on this thing? Because it's going to be very difficult to not focus on everything else, which includes a huge set, an almost infinite set of potential distractions, including stuff that you actually do want to focus on. So the question of why is that so difficult, I hope that kind of gets to the core of it.
Yes, and I think that we can actually use your diagram here, because if it's I need to do this Excel spreadsheet for work.
Yes.
If you change the scope of the problem and you basically expand the context, it's like,
go.
are you really working on something that's intrinsically fulfilling for you?
Nice.
Because then you might not want to need to have to do it. You might want to have to do it. And that might change because the throughput of really the result of that work could be more meaningful or special to you.
Brilliant. This is what the inquiry does. We increase the scope of context and we see this task that I don't want to do can be directly related to something I really want. But I can't see it if I'm down in the weeds. I'm down here, I don't want to. Okay? But, and here's something that's really important. You can build what I call a dopamine link from where you are and what you're trying to do, trying to focus, and where you want to be, what your goal is. And try to remember, your ultimate goal is a desired end state. I don't care what it is you think you want. You remember from our values presentation, why does anyone do anything?
To try to feel better than they do right now.
To try and feel better than they do right now. Ultimately, what you're going to get, or what you hope you're going to get, whether you realize it or not, we can work with this and demonstrate it. What you're ultimately trying to get is a feeling. And that's important to remember because goals energize and drive actions by clearly defining a desired end state. That makes sense? So you've got this end state clearly defined. And you don't have to stay way out there at end state. You can come back and say, it's successfully hitting $1 billion in gross revenue this year. Okay? That's a bunch of zeros after a one. Who cares? Well, I'm going to have this great feeling if I get that. Okay, so there's our goal. But I'm having to make this awful Excel spreadsheet right now. I don't want to do that. Here's the thing about dopamine. It's a miracle, neurochemical that's kind of misunderstood. I'm no neuroscientist. I'm not pretending to be one, but I'd like to suggest that you can think of dopamine not as just some generic pleasure chemical. It isn't. Think of dopamine in terms of what you don't have but want. That makes sense? You don't have it, but you want it. Dopamine starts kicking in the minute you perceive yourself to be on the path of what you want but don't have. And each step closer, you get this little dopamine drip. You've set up what's called a dopamine schedule. You're getting a dopamine feed. Remember that. Because each step then along the way, if it's in fact a doable step, and this is important, I don't want to get too far off the track, but you want something, in order to achieve it, you have to build a path from where you are to where you want to be, the goal. That path has to be made up of what I call doable steps. And a doable step is a step that produces not anxiety, but eager anticipation. If your next step produces overwhelming anxiety, what are you going to do?
Anything but.
Anything but that step. I'd like to suggest that no step is so small that it can't be broken down into an even smaller, more doable step. And each one of those doable steps that produces eager anticipation, and by that I mean it's not just automatic. There's a little bit of novelty to it. I'm pretty sure I can do this, but I don't know. Now I want to try this. And by the way, when I'm talking about little steps, I mean tiny steps, because the object is to do this first step, which leads to your next doable step, which leads to the next doable step. Now you've got momentum. And each one of those steps is producing a tiny little dopamine drip. You've built a link between where you are and where you want to be. Then reward yourself along the path, what I call carrot the path. So there's even more reward for continuing on this path. I finish this Excel spreadsheet and I get a cup of Jamaica Blue Mountain coffee, exactly the way I want it made, but I don't get a drop of it till that Excel spreadsheet's finished. Whoa, I got dopamine coming out of my ears, except I gave up coffee, so that's not going to work for me, but you get the idea. So you build this thing up, and now all of a sudden, this semi-odious task of this Excel spreadsheet has meaning to me. And I'm actually getting a little dopamine hit. Perish the thought, I'm eagerly anticipating this spreadsheet because that spreadsheet's going to be my map. Without the map, I can't find the goal. Whoa. Now the weirdest things happen. This spreadsheet is gold. I love this spreadsheet. I can't wait to do spreadsheets. I know people who are dopamine addicted to making spreadsheets about how to get out of bed in the morning because it makes them feel like they're getting somewhere. You gotta be careful. You do too much of that and you just got a bunch of dopamine-addled spreadsheets. You're way up here someplace. Remember, those spreadsheets are part of a step-by-step path to what it is you want. So you can translate this into, I can take this thing that's so hard to focus on, and by building a dopamine link to my real goal, can't wait for that. Now it's relatively easy to focus on this Excel spreadsheet, where before I was looking to sharpen my pencils. I was doing anything to distract myself.
That's brilliant. So if we go back to the original question, why is focus such a pain point in today's day and age? Mm-hmm. What you've basically just laid out is instead of having such a large task ahead of you,
bingo,
break it down into these doable steps and tinker your state of mind along each step.
But there's a huge difference between doing what I just said and baby steps. Take baby steps, because there's a big part of every one of us that says the step of standing up out of my chair isn't even a step. But I'm telling you, if you're having trouble making that move, break it down until you get to the point where, all right, first thing I have to do is get out of my chair. Well, shit, I can do that. Good. There's your first step. They're not baby steps because most people don't think of that as a step. I had a client who came to me and said, I don't know what to do. I've got to clean out my garage. And I'm embarrassed to even say this. And I said, don't be embarrassed. This is a holographic representation of everybody's problem. Okay? She has to clean out her garage. It's been 14 years. It's a mess. She doesn't know where to start. She can't get started. She's literally feeling bad about herself now. And all we did was go through this very process. Well, what's your first step? I said. Well, I got to get everything in bags and I've got to, and then no. That's too big a step. How do you know it's too big a step? I asked her. She said, because I don't know where to start. Yeah, you don't know where to start, so you're going to do anything but that first step. It's too big. Let's break it down. When we finished breaking it down, guess what the first step was for her?
Get her ass out of the chair.
Not that bad, but I laid it out where she could shift her weight from one butt cheek to the other in the process of getting up out of her chair. She didn't need that. But her first step was open the cabinet door where the garbage bags are. That's it. First step. And we broke it down. I put it on paper. It was like 12 pages of doable steps because I asked her at each step, is this doable? Can you do this? Can you do this? Any anxiety? No. She called me the next night in tears. And I thought, oh God, this thing just blew up. She said, it's done. It's done. She was ecstatic. In one day, she took what was making her life miserable for 14 years because she broke it down into these doable steps. Some of these steps were so small that I declare even you would think, well, that's not a step. The hell it's not. It kept her going. I'm telling you, that's how we made it to the moon. These geniuses at NASA broke an impossible task. 1961, John Kennedy stood up in his inaugural address and said, by the end of this decade, we are going to the moon. And it's like everybody thought, you're out of your mind, cowboy. What the hell did I vote for you for? By 1969, July, those guys were on the moon. And the genius isn't Werner von Braun from Germany. It was, they took that task and broke it down into a series of doable steps that could be accomplished by a monkey. And then they also built into it what they call triple redundancy. If this step doesn't work, do this. If this step doesn't work, do that. If that stuff doesn't work, well, shit, we're screwed. That's what Apollo 13 was about. And that's why you want geniuses as part of that team. Because geniuses on the ground and geniuses in that capsule made a surefire disaster into a successful mission. Because they rehearsed and practiced, rehearsed, and were able to get out of the level of the problem to this meta position. And they put together the rest of a spaceship that had been blown apart out of packets of sweet and low and paper clips. I mean, it was incredible what they did. And they got these guys around the moon and back home safely. Doable steps. And don't be fooled. A doable step is not a baby step. It's whatever you can feel eager anticipation about doing. And I mean that. That's important.
No, and I think it's very important because the eager anticipation versus the anxiety, those are two states of mind, right? And from what you were just talking about is basically putting in, like segmenting the task and then putting in, as you said, carrots to basically maintain state of mind is the key to being able to focus and see the thing from end to end.
There you go.
And I think it's a brilliant point. And you mentioned some sorts of more minor tactics in order to attain that, where it's like, I'll have a big cup of coffee if I get through this Excel. That's another way to sort of hack, I know you hate that term, but hack the dopaminergic system so that you can do the smaller chunks on the way to getting the larger state of mind at the end of it, which is, I'm in tears, I've just cleaned my whole garage, it's been 14 years.
There you go.
Type deal.
There you go.
So that's a brilliant way to answer the question. And I mean, I can't thank you enough, and I'll thank you on behalf of your clients as well, because that's it's a really cool sort of thought process to have.
Yeah, it's
and
helpful.
I think it can really help to break through these walls of sort of paralysis
Yes.
that we can construct within ourselves.
Yes.
Whereas, is it too difficult to get out of bed?
Right.
You know, or is it too difficult to do something like this? And having the overall sort of task be too large, too hairy, and too overwhelming, just break it down into the doable steps where
Yes.
it's like, no, that's simple, that's easy,
Yes.
and you preserve the state. You don't get into that anxious,
Yes.
constricted state.
Yes.
And it's, I mean, incredibly similar to how you were focusing on our conversation earlier, because you were just maintaining your state.
Right.
You're just breathing in and breathing out very slowly, so you don't get into the constricted, anxious states that would be more sort of conducive to distractibility.
Right.
It's really quite wonderful. So again, I tip my hat to you,
Oh,
Mr. John.
bless your heart. Now remember, vis-a-vis focus and defocus, as you're moving along that path, focus, then periodically take a break and defocus completely. We're not meant to stay focused 24/7. Get away from the task. Go outside if possible. Allow your eyes to focus on the most distant thing you can find. If you can find the horizon, great. And let this all defocus, because this unreal world we live in is all about focus, 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 sleep. Focus, 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 sleep. No. And if you'll do this, and I owe a lot neuroscientifically in this piece to Andrew Huberman. I really respect how he has broken this down from a neuroscientific standpoint without bogging it down into, what's the axon and the dendrite doing on your nerve cell? He doesn't do that, but he speaks about focus in very practical yet neuroscientific terminology, because that's what we're doing. So don't try to do one thing all the time. Don't stand on your left toe all day long. You can't. Defocus, and I'm suggesting part of your carrot is a defocus time. When you're drinking that Jamaica Blue Mountain coffee, and I highly recommend it if you like coffee, defocus. Get outside. Look at something way out there somewhere, at the vanishing point, as they call it in perspective. You can do the same thing with your eyes, but you have to learn how to do it. You can defocus your eyes, which is part of what we do when we get still in certain techniques, but defocus. So when you come back, you've got the juju to focus again for a period of time. 90 minutes is a sweet spot. No more than 90 minutes at a time. Then 10 minutes off, 15 minutes off, especially if you quiet your mind. You'll drive your productivity through the roof.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, to the start of the conversation, it's what we're fundamentally wired to do.
Yes.
It's focus for a set amount of time, but there
Yes.
has to be this balance of distractibility. Well,
Yes.
there doesn't have to be. That's what the environment, the environmental
it does.
pressures
You're
sort of
right.
tuned us to be most sort of fit to.
Right.
And so I think it's a very logical tactic to do that in terms of give it unfocused, convergent attention,
Yes.
and then allow that to just completely relax
Yeah.
and to recover
Yes.
to an extent, to
Yeah.
then be able to redouble those efforts and
Yeah.
get back into it.
You're not paying attention. You're going to the bank, right? And you're putting some of this energy back. You're not just spending. You're putting energy back when you defocus.
Completely.
Okay.
And I think the respect that you have for Andrew Huberman is valid too, because if we go back to our diagram here, here's a man that can go all the way down to the very, very,
I think, brilliantly. Yeah.
Yes, and the going through the morass of understanding and having to sort of familiarize yourself with all of the mechanisms that then get you to the point of trying to understand what the axon's doing and where the dendrites are located.
The micro.
Yeah. And then bringing that back up with an authority to be able to, translate the key principles to a population that might not want to focus their attention that deeply on stuff that might be a little bit mundane for some.
But that's the essence of simplicity. The elimination of the unessential and the ability to know what's essential and what isn't. And I think he's masterful at that. Because this is dense stuff we're talking about here. I can get off the track and go off into the weeds because there's so much there. But is it essential? And when I say essential, part of what I mean is there is a certain emotional condiment to it. There's a certain dramatic flavor to it. It's not just data. But too much of that emotional stuff gets in the way, but just enough ties it in so it has deeper meaning. And I think that's very important to find that sweet spot. It's not the same for all of us. That's why dealing with a huge audience, like Huberman's audience, is a real trick. Are all of these people capable of keeping up with him neuroscientifically? No, but a lot of them are. A lot of them don't want to be talked down to. Get into the axons, the dendrites. Get into that. I want to know all about that synaptic core. I want to know what's happening. Okay, but a lot of other people don't. So he manages to walk that line. And I've never felt that he's talking down to anybody. That's a real gift.
Well, speaking of real gifts, I haven't felt that you've spoken down to me really ever. Actually, I felt you inflate me a couple of times, even in this conversation.
No. You're more brilliant than you'll ever know. Seriously.
It's very nice of you to say.
It's true.
But I think we're probably hitting that sweet spot because I'm starting to feel as if it's time to defocus.
Good. That's a perfect way to end this because it is an instinct. You can sense it, but you're getting feedback that says it's time. Trust that.
Well, Mr. George, thank you for another lovely conversation.
Oh, thank you. And thank you. Without you, we're sitting here in a vacuum. Pretty sad.
So, as always, thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. Now, if you're looking to build a stillness practice yourself, we have a lot of free resources, audios that Jim's recorded, etc., and you can see those in our show notes below. Along with that, there are also online courses that you can roll in if you want to learn more from Jim. We also have Obsidian mind maps. You can see a couple of them popping up here on the screen. Now, these are really cool ways to look at the podcast information and really just get an overview of all of the podcast topics and deepen the information within yourself. And within them, there are more of Jim's recordings. There's also a lot of Jim's artwork. So if you're interested in any more still life stuff, you can find a bunch of links in the description below. Finally, I really hope that you're getting as much out of this as I have. This is why we started this whole thing in the first place, because the combination of Jim and the practice of stillness had really helped to transform our lives here at Still Life. We just wanted to make as much of that available to you. So hopefully you're getting a lot out of it. And please let us know if there's anything that you want to see more of in the future or less of. Anyway, hope you have a lovely day. Bye-bye.